What if the most alive places on Earth were hidden inside what looks completely lifeless? Beyond the endless dunes of Morocco Sahara edge, where heat erases distance and silence stretches beyond sound, there are places that should not exist, yet do. Pockets of green, water beneath sand, life where nothing should survive. These are the lost oases, forgotten, distant, and quietly enduring. This is not just a journey into the desert, this is a journey into contradiction, where emptiness holds life and survival becomes something deeper than strength. Where the desert refuses to be empty. From a distance, the desert convinces you of a simple conclusion. Emptiness. It stretches outward in every direction, dissolving detail until only repetition remains. Sand, wind, heat, and skyform are systems so stripped down that the human mind instinctively labels it as void. Nothing here appears to resist the idea of absence, but that interpretation belongs to distance, not reality. The moment you step into the desert, the illusion begins to fracture. The Sahara is not a blank surface, it is a structured environment built on subtle variation. Dunes shift in shape depending on wind patterns. Sand carries different mineral tones that alter its color under changing light. Even the silence is not uniform, it carries texture, interrupted by faint environmental signals that most observers fail to register at first. What appears empty is actually filtered. Life in the desert does not present itself openly. It operates under constraints so extreme that visibility is not its strategy, survival is. Organisms here do not spread outward, they compress inward. They retreat into soil, shade, burrows, and time cycles that avoid the most hostile conditions. Plants reduce their visible structure while expanding their root systems deep into hidden moisture. Insects and reptiles synchronize activity with narrow temperature windows. The result is a landscape that refuses obvious interpretation. You do not see abundance, so you assume absence. But that assumption collapses under observation. The desert is not lacking life, it is reorganizing it. Instead of density on the surface, there is depth beneath it. Instead of constant activity, there is timed emergence. And once this becomes clear, the perception of the desert shifts completely. It is no longer a place defined by what is missing. It becomes a place defined by what is concealed, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. The edge where sand meets light. There is a point in the desert where the logic of survival changes abruptly. It is not gradual, and it is not subtle. One step, you are surrounded by endless sand and heat that dominates every sense. The next, the environment fractures into something unexpectedly structured. A line of green appears. This boundary is not aesthetic, it is geological. It marks the transition between two entirely different systems of existence. On one side lies aridity pushed to its limits. On the other lies concentration, life compressed into narrow corridors sustained by something hidden beneath the surface. The shift feels almost artificial at first. Vegetation does not usually negotiate with desert conditions, it avoids them. Yet here, it stands in deliberate opposition to everything around it. Palm clusters rise vertically where the landscape elsewhere refuses vertical structure. Soil darkens, the air cools slightly. Even sound becomes more defined, as though the environment itself has gained layers. This edge exists because of what cannot be seen. Below the surface, water moves slowly through underground reservoirs, trapped by geological formations that prevent it from evaporating. It does not rise everywhere, only where pressure, composition, and time align correctly. Where it does reach the surface, life follows immediately, not cautiously. What appears as a sudden transformation is actually a precise response to hidden infrastructure. The desert does not end here, it negotiates. It allows life only in measured pockets, where conditions permit survival without compromise. That is why the boundary feels so sharp. It is not blending, it is selection. And standing at that edge, the realization becomes unavoidable. The desert is not uniformly hostile, it is selectively supportive. Life is not absent, it is geographically rationed. Where water surfaces, everything reorganizes instantly around it. The edge then is not a border between life and non-life. It is a visible consequence of invisible systems deciding where life becomes possible. A horizon that feels endless. The horizon in the Sahara does something unusual to perception. It removes reference. There are no structures to break distance, no elevation changes to define proximity, no familiar anchors that allow the mind to calculate scale in the usual way. Everything dissolves into a continuous gradient of sand meeting the sky. At first, this appears simple, vastness. But vastness alone does not explain the psychological effect. As you move through the desert, the horizon remains fixed, yet unreachable in a way that disrupts internal mapping. Distances stop behaving predictably. What looks near requires prolonged effort to reach. What seems far can suddenly appear without warning after a shift in elevation or light. The desert does not distort space, it removes confirmation of it. Without landmarks, the brain loses its usual calibration system. Navigation becomes less about measurement and more about interpretation. Shadows, wind direction, texture of sand, and subtle slope changes become primary tools of orientation. The horizon ceases to function as a boundary and becomes a continuous suggestion rather than a fixed line. This produces a strange mental state. You are aware of direction, but not certainty. You are moving, but without the reassurance of progress markers. The landscape does not reward quick interpretation, it forces sustained attention, and yet, the experience is not chaotic. It is structured in a way that feels almost deliberate. The desert removes distractions so completely that perception sharpens in response. You begin noticing patterns in wind-carved ridges, temperature shifts across time, and the rhythmic repetition of dune formations. Eventually, something subtle happens. You stop trying to define the horizon and start adapting to it. Because in this environment, distance is not a measurement on a map, it is a lived condition. The horizon does not tell you where you are going, it reflects how you perceive movement itself. The first glimpse of hidden grain. It begins as an inconsistency. At first, the desert appears unchanged, uniform sand, continuous light, unbroken heat. Then, almost imperceptibly, something interrupts that uniformity. A variation in tone, a slight darkening near the edge of perception. The eye resists it, attempting to classify it as shadow or distortion, but it persists. As you move closer, the inconsistency resolves into structure. What seemed like an anomaly becomes a pattern. And then, unmistakably, color emerges, green, dense and layered, cutting through the dominance of sand. An oasis does not announce itself, it reveals itself. The transition is not just visual, the environment begins to shift in sensory detail. Heat reduces in intensity as shade accumulates. Air carries moisture in trace amounts that were previously absent. Sound changes character. Instead of pure silence, there is now fragmentation, movement in leaves, water flow beneath surface channels, insect activity. What makes this moment powerful is contrast. The desert does not gradually yield to greenery, it collides with it. The boundary feels intentional, as though two systems with incompatible logic are meeting without merging, one built on scarcity, the other on concentration. And yet, the oasis is not an interruption, it is an outcome. It exists because underground conditions allow it. Water stored beneath layers of sand reaches a threshold where it can no longer remain hidden. When it surfaces, even partially, life organizes itself around it immediately. Vegetation does not struggle into existence here, it responds to opportunity that has been accumulating invisibly for long periods. The first glimpse of green is therefore not discovery alone, it is recognition. Recognition that beneath a landscape defined by absence, there are precise points where abundance is not only possible, but already established. An oasis that shouldn't exist. At first glance, an oasis feels like a contradiction made visible. Everything surrounding it argues against its presence. The desert enforces a regime of dryness so complete that survival appears improbable. And yet, here, life is not only present, it is structured, sustained, and self-reinforcing. Palm trees rise in organized clusters. Vegetation spreads in layered density. Water exists in pools or channels, sometimes visible, sometimes implied through soil saturation. The entire system appears as if it has been placed rather than formed, but it has not been placed. It has been constructed by time. An oasis is the result of underground hydrological systems interacting with geological formations that trap and channel water. Aquifers store moisture accumulated over long periods, sometimes spanning centuries or more. Pressure gradients allow that water to rise selectively, surfacing only where natural fractures or permeability thresholds exist. What appears impossible is actually highly conditional. The desert does not allow random life. It permits localized emergence where physics and geology align. In those regions, life does not hesitate, it accelerates. Vegetation grows quickly because it operates within a narrow window of opportunity defined by water availability. This creates the illusion of improbability. But the oasis is not defiance of the environment, it is specialization within it. Life here is not resisting the desert, it is adapting to its hidden architecture. And once this is understood, the emotional reaction changes. What once felt like an anomaly becomes a system. The oasis is no longer a miracle that breaks desert logic. It is proof that the desert's logic is more complex than its surface suggests. It should not exist in the way we first assume it does. But it exists exactly as conditions allow. Water hidden beneath silence. The silence of the desert is deceptive. It appears total, uninterrupted, absolute. There are no visible rivers, no flowing streams, no obvious signs of hydrological movement. The surface offers no indication that water plays any role in sustaining life here. To an untrained perception, the desert feels disconnected from anything fluid or dynamic beneath it. But that interpretation belongs only to the surface. Below the sand lies a slow, persistent system of movement. Water does not disappear in deserts, it relocates. It travels through subterranean channels, stored in porous rock layers, held in aquifers that function as long-term reservoirs. This movement is not visible, but it is continuous. It is also patient. Unlike surface water systems that respond quickly to rainfall and evaporation cycles, underground water operates on geological timescales. It accumulates gradually, shifts slowly, and emerges only under specific conditions. Where pressure builds or structural weaknesses occur, it rises toward the surface in limited, localized points. Those points become oases. What makes this system significant is not its visibility, but its persistence. Even in environments that appear entirely devoid of moisture, water remains present in structural form. It is not absent, it is redistributed. And this changes how silence itself is understood. The silence of the desert is not empty, it is layered. It sits above constant but hidden movement. Every still moment on the surface is supported by processes occurring far beneath perception. Once this is understood, the desert transforms conceptually. It is no longer a landscape defined by lack of water, it becomes a landscape defined by hidden hydrology, where what is essential is not erased but concealed. And in that realization, the silence stops being proof of absence. It becomes evidence of depth. Life growing where nothing should. The desert constructs a strong expectation before you ever step into it. It is defined in the mind as a place of absence, heat that drains, dryness that dominates, and conditions that seem fundamentally incompatible with sustained life. It presents itself as an environment where survival is not impossible, but improbable, and yet that expectation collapses as soon as you observe closely. Life exists here, not as an exception, but as a pattern. It does not appear fragile or accidental. It is structured, deliberate in its adaptation, and often more resilient than life in less extreme environments. Green shoots emerge from soil that looks incapable of supporting anything. Trees anchor themselves with root systems that extend far deeper than their visible presence suggests, reaching toward hidden moisture reservoirs beneath the sand. These are not isolated anomalies. They are expressions of a broader principle. Life does not require ideal conditions, it requires usable ones. The desert rarely offers abundance, but it consistently offers thresholds. Small amounts of moisture, brief periods of shade, micro-environments created by terrain variation or underground water retention. Each of these becomes enough, and enough is the critical threshold. Once viability exists, even in minimal form, biological systems respond fully. Growth begins immediately, without hesitation or delay. Plants do not wait for improved conditions, they maximize whatever is available. Ecosystems form in tightly constrained pockets, operating on efficiency rather than expansion. This creates a reversal of expectation. Instead of life struggling to survive in a hostile environment, you observe life optimizing itself around constraint. Survival here is not resistance, it is precision. The desert, then, is not a place where life should fail to exist. It is a place where life is forced to define exactly how little it needs to continue existing at all. And in that definition, it becomes clear life is not governed by ideal environments, but by the boundaries of possibility itself. The illusion of emptiness. From a distance, the desert appears definitive in its emptiness. It presents a surface that seems uniform. Endless sand stretching without interruption, without variation, without visible indication of complexity beneath it. The mind interprets this immediately as absence. No structures, no movement, no life. But that interpretation is based on limitation, not reality. Emptiness in the desert is not a natural condition, it is a perceptual one. What is missing is not existence, but visibility. The surface layer is only the most simplified expression of a far more complex system operating underneath. Below the sand, movement continues continuously. Water flows through underground channels, stored in aquifers and redistributed through geological formations that do not reveal themselves at the surface. Plant life extends far beyond what is visible, with root systems forming dense networks designed to locate and extract hidden moisture. Even microbial ecosystems persist in soil layers that appear inert to the naked eye. The surface itself is also misleading. Sand is not static. It is constantly reshaped by wind, pressure, and temperature variation. Dunes shift position over time, patterns form and disappear, and the landscape reconfigures itself in cycles that are invisible without temporal observation. What appears permanent is actually transient. What appears empty is actually dynamic. The illusion persists because the desert minimizes obvious signals. It does not present complexity in a way that is immediately readable. Instead, it distributes that complexity across layers, geological, biological, and atmospheric, each operating at different scales of time and perception. Once this is understood, the concept of emptiness dissolves entirely. What remains is not absence, but concealment. Not void, but structure that resists immediate interpretation. The desert does not lack content, it hides it beneath simplicity so absolute that it becomes deceptive. And in that realization, emptiness stops being a truth about the desert and becomes a limitation of observation itself. A landscape that tests belief. The desert is not only an environmental system, it is a perceptual challenge. It does not simply expose the body to heat and distance, it exposes the mind to uncertainty. Every element within it contributes to a subtle but continuous test of belief. At first, the test appears physical. The intensity of heat, the absence of shade, and the vastness of open space push the body toward adaptation or retreat. But beneath that physical layer lies a more persistent pressure, the erosion of expectation. In environments where nothing appears to change, the mind begins to construct certainty based on visible absence. If no life is seen, it assumes life is not present. If no water is visible, it assumes water does not exist. These assumptions become internalized quickly because the landscape offers no immediate contradiction. Until it does, the appearance of an oasis disrupts the entire framework. What was previously categorized as impossible becomes visible without warning. Water exists where logic suggested it should not. Vegetation thrives where conditions appear hostile. And in that moment, perception is forced to recalibrate. The desert itself does not change during this shift. The physical reality remains constant. What changes is the observer's interpretive model. The landscape exposes the gap between perception and reality, not by misleading, but by withholding immediate clarity. This is where the test occurs. It is not about endurance alone, it is about epistemology, how belief is formed and how quickly it can be corrected. The desert forces confrontation with the limits of inference based purely on surface observation. Once this is experienced, it extends beyond geography. It becomes a reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in systems where complexity is layered and hidden. The desert does not just contain life. It exposes the fragility of assumptions about where life can and cannot be. Survival written into sand. In the Sahara, survival is not an occasional event, it is an embedded structure. It is written into every layer of the environment, not as narrative, but as function. Everything that persists here does so through adaptations so precise that it becomes indistinguishable from the landscape itself. This adaptation is visible in multiple scales simultaneously. At the biological level, plants are engineered by necessity rather than design. Leaf structures minimize water loss. Root systems extend vertically and horizontally in search of scarce moisture. Growth patterns are slow, conservative, and efficient. Nothing is excessive because excess cannot be sustained. At the human level, survival becomes architectural and behavioral. Buildings are shaped to deflect heat and preserve cool interiors. Daily routines are organized around temperature cycles rather than conventional time structures. Movement is calculated, not spontaneous, because environmental conditions dictate feasibility. Even the landscape itself participates in this structure. Wind-carved sand formations record environmental forces. Dune patterns indicate directionality and intensity of prevailing winds. Shifts in terrain reflect long-term atmospheric behavior. These patterns are not decorative, they are data encoded in physical form. What emerges is a system where survival is not separate from environment, but integrated into it. Nothing exists in opposition to the desert, because opposition is unsustainable. Instead, existence becomes alignment. Life does not resist conditions, it integrates them into its operating logic. This removes the traditional boundary between organism and environment. The desert does not host life as an external feature. It shapes life as an internal necessity. And once that integration is complete, survival is no longer visible as struggle, it becomes structured. Not something occurring against the environment, but something expressed through it. In the sand, survival is not written as an exception, it is written as design. The heat that shapes everything. In the Sahara, heat is not an environmental detail, it is the primary structure that defines existence. Everything else in the landscape is secondary to it. It does not behave like a passing condition such as weather, it behaves like a constant physical presence that reshapes both matter and behavior. By midday, this presence becomes undeniable. The sun is no longer interpreted as a distant object in the sky. It feels closer, heavier, almost directional in its pressure. The air loses its clarity and begins to behave differently. Density increases, light scatters more aggressively, and the horizon itself appears unstable, as though heat is subtly distorting visual precision. Nothing in the desert exists outside this influence. Sand absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly afterward, extending thermal exposure far beyond sunlight hours. Stone structures accumulate temperature until they become part of the heat cycle themselves. Even living organisms cannot avoid it, they must reorganize their behavior around it entirely. This is why survival here is not reactive, but structural. Life does not attempt to confront heat directly because resistance is unsustainable. Instead, it reorganizes around it. Activity shifts into cooler hours. Shade becomes an infrastructural requirement rather than a comfort. Water is treated as a limiting resource rather than an available one. Every action is timed against thermal intensity. And in that adaptation, a pattern emerges. The heat is not an obstacle within the environment, it is the environment's governing logic. It determines rhythm, limits possibility, and defines survival thresholds. Nothing operates independently of it. Once this is understood, perception changes. The desert is no longer seen as simply hot or dry. It becomes a system organized around thermal dominance, where every form of life is an adjustment to a single controlling force. In the Sahara, heat is not something to be endured, it is something interpreted and lived through precisely when the sun becomes a presence. In most environments, the sun is background, important but distant. In the desert, that relationship collapses. The sun stops being something observed and becomes something experienced continuously, as though it has entered the same spatial layer as the observer. It does not change its position in a dramatic way, yet its psychological weight increases throughout the day. The sky remains clear, unbroken, and visually simple, but that simplicity is deceptive. Without atmospheric diffusion, sunlight arrives with full intensity, unfiltered and uncompromised. This creates a shift in awareness. You no longer interpret sunlight as illumination, you interpret it as exposure. Movement becomes conditional on its angle and intensity. The body begins to calculate duration in direct relation to how long it can remain under open sky without relief. The sun becomes a regulating reference point for behavior. What makes this transformation significant is its consistency. There are no interruptions, no clouds to soften its presence, no environmental breaks to reset perception. It maintains uninterrupted dominance across time, creating a stable but unavoidable pressure. And because it never varies enough to be ignored, it becomes integrated into perception itself. Shadows become primary markers of safety. Timing becomes spatial rather than chronological. Orientation is guided not just by direction, but by exposure gradients. In this way, the sun is no longer external. It becomes part of the decision-making framework for every action within the desert. The psychological effect is subtle but persistent. Awareness is constantly shaped by a single source of intensity that never withdraws. And once that awareness stabilizes, something changes. The sun is no longer seen as part of the sky. It is experienced as a constant presence that defines the limits of interaction with everything else. Shadows that offer temporary escape. In a landscape dominated by overwhelming light, shadows acquire an importance that is almost structural. They are not aesthetic contrasts, they are functional interruptions in a system defined by exposure. A shadow in the desert is never permanent. It is always conditional, always dependent on position, angle, and time. A palm tree creates a circular zone of relief that shifts slowly throughout the day. A rock produces a narrow band of cooler air that disappears as the sun moves. Even man-made structures offer protection only for limited periods before the geometry of light changes. This impermanence defines their value. Shadows are not spaces of comfort that can be relied upon. They are opportunities that must be used when available. Their existence is transient, and that transience shapes behavior. Movement becomes synchronized with shadow cycles. Rest is not scheduled, it is opportunistic. Over time, this creates a different relationship with relief itself. In environments where shade is abundant and stable, comfort becomes passive. In the desert, comfort becomes active. It must be located, entered, and utilized before it disappears. This changes perception of time. Waiting becomes strategic rather than idle. There is also a psychological effect tied to this instability. Because shadows cannot be controlled, they cannot be possessed. They exist independently of need. This introduces a constant awareness that relief is external and temporary, not guaranteed or stable. And yet, precisely because of this uncertainty, shadows gain significance far beyond their physical size or duration. They become points of recalibration, moments where the body resets, the mind slows, and survival energy is conserved. In the desert, relief is not continuous. It is negotiated in fragments of time defined by moving light. The stillness of midday silence. At midday in the desert, the environment appears to enter a state of suspension. It is not inactive, but it becomes significantly less responsive at the surface level. Heat reaches its peak intensity, and as a result, movement across the landscape decreases dramatically. This reduction is not symbolic, it is functional. Most living systems withdraw into protective states. Animals reduce activity to conserve energy and water. Humans limit exposure by seeking shade or remaining stationary. Even vegetation appears less expressive, with reduced visible movement as transpiration rates adjust to thermal stress. The result is a perceptual shift in the environment. Sound becomes minimal, not because it is absent, but because sources of motion are reduced. Wind patterns weaken, surface disturbances decrease, and atmospheric agitation becomes rare. The environment does not become silent, it becomes compressed into stillness. This stillness alters the experience of time. Without motion as a reference point, temporal perception becomes less structured. Minutes feel less differentiated from one another because there are fewer environmental changes to mark progression. The landscape appears fixed, as though it has entered a temporary equilibrium. But this equilibrium is deceptive. Beneath the surface level of stillness, thermal processes continue operating at full intensity. Heat is absorbed, stored, and redistributed continuously. The lack of motion is not absence. It is energy redistribution at a slower, more controlled, visible rate. In this state, attention shifts inward. Small details become more noticeable. Grain patterns in sand, subtle variations in brightness, faint atmospheric distortions at the horizon line. The environment does not stop communicating. It reduces its signals to minimal form. Midday silence is therefore not emptiness. It is a compression of activity into its most essential expression. Where the desert is not quiet because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening beneath the threshold of visible motion. A world that slows under heat. The desert does not eliminate life's pace, it recalibrates it. Everything within it operates under a different definition of efficiency, where movement is no longer driven by speed, but by necessity. Heat functions as a regulatory constraint that filters out excess action. In this environment, urgency loses relevance. Walking becomes deliberate because unnecessary energy expenditure carries direct cost. Speech becomes limited because communication is streamlined to essential information. Even cognitive processes adjust, prioritizing immediate environmental awareness over abstract planning. This shift is not imposed externally, it is learned through continuous interaction with conditions that reward conservation. What emerges is a behavioral economy centered on preservation. Every action is evaluated against thermal and energetic costs. Nothing is performed without justification. Over time, this creates a rhythm that is fundamentally slower than environments where energy is abundant. But slower does not mean diminished. In fact, perception becomes more refined. When speed decreases, detail becomes more accessible. The texture of the environment, the subtle changes in temperature, and the movement of air currents become more noticeable. Attention expands horizontally instead of racing forward. This produces a different kind of awareness. Instead of moving through time rapidly, experience becomes layered within it. Moments are not skipped, they are fully occupied. This creates a sense of depth that is often absent in faster environments, where transitions happen too quickly to fully register. And eventually, this altered rhythm feels natural, not as limitation, but as calibration. The desert does not remove intensity from life, it redistributes it into fewer, more meaningful actions. In that redistribution, time itself becomes less about speed and more about precision. Life sustained by balance. The desert is not an environment that tolerates imbalance for long. Its conditions are too extreme, its resources too limited, and its margins for error too narrow. In such a system, survival is not determined by strength alone, it is determined by equilibrium. Everything that exists here does so within tightly controlled boundaries. Oases survive because their internal systems are regulated by necessity. Water is not distributed freely, it is allocated carefully through natural constraints. Vegetation grows in layers that optimize shade and moisture retention. Evaporation is minimized through structural interaction between plants, soil, and atmosphere. Nothing exceeds its limit. This restraint is not imposed externally, it emerges naturally from environmental pressure. If any component expands beyond what resources can support, the system destabilizes. If any element diminishes too much, collapse follows. Stability exists only within a narrow range, and yet within that narrow range, life persists continuously. This creates a form of sustainability that is fundamentally different from abundance-based systems. It does not rely on surplus, it relies on precision. Every function is calibrated not for growth without limit, but for continuation without failure. Over time, this produces a behavioral and ecological pattern where balance is not an objective, it is an instinctive requirement. Life does not attempt to maximize conditions, it adjusts to maintain equilibrium within them. And this adjustment becomes so consistent that it defines the structure of existence itself. What emerges is a system where survival is inseparable from moderation. Too much disrupts, too little collapses, and only balance sustains. In that framework, the desert reveals a broader principle. Stability is not found in abundance, but in alignment. And life, here, continues not because conditions are ideal, but because they remain within the limits that balance can hold. Villages carved from Earth itself. In the Sahara, villages do not impose themselves upon the landscape, they emerge as extensions of it. At a glance, they are easy to miss. There is no visual interruption, no sharp architectural break from the surrounding desert. Instead, the settlement appears as a continuation of the terrain, as if the ground itself has thickened into structure. This visual blending is not accidental. It is the result of material and method working in alignment with the environment. Local earth, clay, and sand are shaped into walls that retain the same tonal palette as the desert itself. As a result, buildings do not contrast with their surroundings, they echo them. What appears as uniformity is actually integration. These villages are not designed to stand apart from nature, they are designed to remain within it without disruption. There is no separation between constructed space and natural space in the way urban environments typically define it. Instead, there is continuity. The landscape flows into habitation without visual or structural rupture. This creates a different architectural philosophy, one where presence is defined by belonging rather than distinction. And in that belonging, function and environment become inseparable. The village does not exist in opposition to the desert. It exists as a contained expression of it, shaped by the same forces that shape dunes, wind patterns, and temperature cycles. What you are seeing then is not an imposition on the desert. It is the desert reorganized into livable form without losing its identity. Homes that blend into the desert. From any distance, the boundary between desert and habitation becomes increasingly difficult to define. The transition is not marked by clear edges or artificial separation. Instead, it dissolves into continuity, where built forms and natural terrain appear to merge rather than meet. Walls adopt the same muted tones as surrounding sand. Surfaces reflect the environment rather than contrast with it. Shapes are soft and adaptive, often guided by wind patterns, material availability, and thermal necessity rather than rigid architectural symmetry. This blending is not merely aesthetic, it is an environmental strategy. In extreme heat conditions, visual and material integration reduces thermal stress and improves functional efficiency. Structures that mirror the desert's color palette absorb less visual heat intensity. Earthen materials regulate internal temperatures more effectively than artificial ones, creating a natural buffer between exterior extremes and interior stability. Inside these homes, environmental separation becomes partial rather than absolute. The desert is not excluded, it is moderated. Air, temperature, and light are filtered rather than blocked. This creates a living condition where inhabitants are not isolated from their surroundings, but are continuously in calibrated interaction with them. The result is a softened boundary between human space and natural space. You do not feel as though you have entered a sealed interior disconnected from the world outside. Instead, you feel embedded within a controlled extension of it. The home becomes less of a barrier and more of a mediator. In this architecture, blending is not passive camouflage, it is active adaptation, a way of ensuring that survival does not depend on resisting the desert, but on becoming visually and materially consistent with it. Architecture shaped by survival. In the Sahara, architecture is not an expression of style or identity, it is the direct response to environmental necessity. Every structural decision is governed by conditions that leave no room for excess or abstraction. Function always precedes form. Walls are constructed with thickness not for visual weight, but for thermal resistance. Dense earthen materials slow the transfer of heat, creating internal environments that remain stable despite external extremes. Openings are intentionally small, limiting direct sunlight exposure and reducing heat infiltration while still allowing essential airflow. Spatial design follows environmental logic. Courtyards are not decorative features, they are functional systems that regulate air movement and temperature circulation. Narrow passages reduce heat exposure during movement between structures. Orientation of buildings often reflects wind direction and sun path rather than geometric preference. Nothing in this architecture exists without purpose. This creates a built environment where design is inseparable from survival strategy. Every feature is a response to pressure, thermal, structural, and resource-based. Over time, these responses become standardized, passed through generations not as theoretical knowledge, but as practice necessity. What emerges is a form of architecture that is continuously validated by environment. If a structure fails, it does not persist. If it succeeds, it becomes tradition. This process eliminates unnecessary design and preserves only what works under sustained stress. As a result, buildings in the desert do not feel like imposed constructs placed upon the land. They feel like outcomes of long-term environmental negotiation, forms that have been refined until they align completely with the conditions that produce them. In this sense, architecture here is not built against the desert, it is built through it. Walls that hold back the heat. Heat in the desert is not a temporary condition, it is a constant environmental force that exerts continuous pressure on every surface it touches. It does not arrive in waves. It accumulates, persists, and lingers long after direct sunlight has shifted. Within this context, walls become more than structural boundaries, they become thermal systems. Thick earthen walls function as regulators rather than barriers. Their material composition allows them to absorb heat gradually during the day, delaying internal temperature rise. This absorption is not immediate, which prevents rapid heat transfer into interior spaces. Instead, heat is stored and released slowly over time, often during cooler nighttime periods when its impact is less disruptive. This creates a balancing effect. Interior environments remain significantly more stable than external conditions, not because heat is eliminated, but because it is redistributed across time. The result is a moderated space where extreme fluctuations are softened into manageable variation. Inside these structures, the difference is perceptible immediately. Air feels less aggressive. Temperature changes are slower. The sense of environmental pressure is reduced, not removed. It is not insulation in the absolute sense, it is negotiation between two thermal states. Importantly, this system does not oppose the desert, it responds to it. Heat cannot be stopped, but it can be delayed, diffused, and balanced. The walls are therefore not defensive structures, they are adaptive interfaces between human habitation and environmental intensity. Over time, this method becomes refined through repetition and experience. Generations learn how to optimize thickness, material composition, and spatial design to maintain equilibrium. And in that refinement, a principle becomes clear. Survival in the desert is not about exclusion of heat, but about understanding its behavior well enough to live alongside it. Living inside the landscape. In most environments, human life is constructed in separation from nature. Buildings are designed as controlled interiors that exclude environmental variability. Boundaries are clear, inside is regulated, outside is external and often resisted. In the Sahara, that separation is incomplete. Life here does not position itself against the environment, it operates within it. Villages are not isolated systems placed upon the desert, they are embedded nodes inside a larger ecological and climatic structure. The landscape is not something to be excluded from daily life, it is something that continuously shapes it. Movement patterns reflect environmental rhythm. Activity is aligned with temperature cycles rather than fixed schedules. Structural placement responds to terrain, wind flow, and resource availability. Even social and domestic routines are influenced by environmental constraints that cannot be ignored. This produces a different kind of spatial relationship. The desert is not outside in a strict sense. It is present in every aspect of life, even when not directly visible. Its influence extends into architecture, behavior, and timing. Boundaries become porous rather than absolute. And within that porosity, perception shift. The environment is no longer interpreted as an opposing force. It becomes a condition of existence that must be continuously acknowledged and understood. Resistance becomes less relevant than adaptation. Control becomes less important than coordination. Over time, this leads to a form of coexistence that is structurally integrated rather than conceptually divided. Life is not removed from the desert. It is arranged within it, shaped by it, and sustained through ongoing interaction with it. And in that arrangement, survival becomes less about separation and more about alignment with the landscape itself, the people who never left. In the Sahara, staying is not passive, it is intentional. When an environment demands constant adaptation, continuity itself becomes a form of decision making. The people who live on the desert's edge are not there by inertia or limitation. They remain because they have developed a deep functional understanding of the land that surrounds them. This relationship is not abstract, it is practical, embodied, and precise. To live here is to read conditions that are not always visible. Wind shifts are interpreted before they become physically noticeable. Temperature patterns are understood as signals for movement, rest, or conservation. Resource management, especially water and shade, is not improvisational, it is calibrated through experience. Knowledge in this environment does not exist as written instruction. It exists as accumulated awareness. It is passed through lived repetition, observation, correction, and adaptation across generations. And because of that, it becomes embedded rather than memorized. Leaving the desert is always possible in theory, but staying represents something more complex than geography. It represents continuity of understanding, a refusal to disconnect from a system that has shaped perception itself. What emerges is a relationship to place that is not emotional in a superficial sense, nor purely utilitarian. It is structural. The environment is not home in the comforting sense. It is an intelligible system that one learns to navigate with precision. And in that precision, identity and landscape begin to overlap. A culture built on endurance. Endurance in the Sahara is not an exceptional state. It is the baseline condition through which life organizes itself. It is not something demonstrated occasionally under pressure. It is something embedded into daily structure. Every cultural pattern reflects this reality. Resources are managed with strict awareness of limitations. Food is preserved not for abundance, but for continuity. Water is allocated carefully, treated as a stabilizing element rather than a consumable convenience. Time is not structured around excess activity, but around environmental feasibility. This creates a cultural logic where efficiency replaces excess. But it is important to distinguish endurance from suffering. In this context, endurance is not framed as hardship endured reluctantly. It is a system of discipline aligned with environmental reality. The goal is not to resist conditions, but to remain compatible with them over time. Routines become stable because instability is costly. Habits persist because they have been tested against environmental pressure and proven viable. Culture, therefore, does not evolve toward convenience, it evolves toward reliability. And in that reliability, something distinct emerges, a way of life that is not dependent on surplus, expansion, or acceleration. Instead, it is sustained through controlled balance, careful resource allocation, and long-term consistency. Endurance becomes more than survival strategy. It becomes cultural structure, not defined by what is added, but by what is consistently maintained. Traditions carried through isolation. Isolation in the desert does not simply separate communities from external influence, it stabilizes internal continuity. In remote regions of the Sahara, distance has functioned as a form of preservation, allowing practices to remain intact across long spans of time. What persists here is not preserved artificially, it persists because it continues to function. Agricultural techniques adapted to minimal water remain in use because they remain effective under persistent scarcity. Construction methods designed for heat resistance continue because they solve environmental constraints better than alternatives. Daily practices are structured around conditions that have not fundamentally changed, making adaptation less necessary than elsewhere. This creates a form of cultural continuity that is not dependent on reinforcement, it is dependent on relevance. Traditions here are not symbolic connections to the past, they are operational systems. They exist because they still solve present problems. There is no pressure to replace them with newer systems unless those systems demonstrate superior functionality under identical constraints. As a result, change occurs slowly, not due to resistance, but due to stability. When environmental conditions remain consistent, the pressure for cultural replacement decreases. What works remains in place. What fails is naturally phased out. This produces a rare form of temporal continuity, where practices are not separated from their origins by rapid transformation. Instead, they remain functionally connected to their initial purpose. In this sense, isolation does not freeze culture, it filters it, retaining only what continues to work within the conditions that define existence. Stories pass through standard time. In the Sahara, stories do not rely on permanence of medium. They are not anchored in monuments, written records, or fixed architectural structures. Instead, they are carried through human memory, sustained through repetition and retelling. This method of transmission shapes the nature of the stories themselves. Narratives are grounded in lived experience, journeys across shifting dunes, encounters with scarcity, decisions made under uncertainty, and survival within unpredictable environmental conditions. They are not constructed for embellishment, but for continuity. Their value lies in accuracy, not exaggeration. Because the environment itself is extreme, storytelling does not require amplification. Reality already provides intensity. What matters is the clarity of transmission. Each retelling acts as a form of preservation. Details that are essential to survival, navigation cues, seasonal patterns, resource locations are embedded within narrative structures. Over time, these stories function as both cultural memory and practical archive, and yet they remain fluid. Like the sand itself, they shift slightly with each transmission, adapting to the voice and context of the teller, but the core remains intact because it is repeatedly reinforced through necessity. In this way, stories become parallel to the landscape they originate from, dynamic, responsive, and continuously shaped by time. They do not resist change, they move with it, while preserving meaning across generations. Life at the edge of harsh beauty. The Sahara is often described through contradiction, beauty and severity existing in the same space. But this is not a contradiction in practice, it is coexistence within a single system. The landscape is visually expansive, structured through simplicity, vast dunes, uninterrupted horizons, and silence that stretches across distance. This creates a sense of aesthetic clarity, but that clarity does not remove difficulty, it frames it. Heat is constant, resources are limited, environmental conditions demand continuous awareness. Every element that contributes to visual beauty also contributes to functional pressure. This duality defines the experience of the desert. Nothing here is purely comforting or purely hostile. The same silence that creates perception of peace also removes environmental cues. The same openness that produces visual awe also eliminates shelter. The same simplicity that feels calming also requires constant adaptation. This is why the desert cannot be reduced to a single interpretation. It is not simply harsh, it is not simply beautiful. It is a system where both properties exist simultaneously and neither can be separated from the other. Living within this system requires acceptance of that dual structure, not as a contradiction, but as a condition. Meaning is not found in one aspect alone, but in their interaction. And over time, that interaction reshapes perception itself. What initially appears extreme becomes intelligible. What feels overwhelming becomes structured. And what seems distant becomes immediate through experience. At the edge of the desert, life is not defined by escape from difficulty. It is defined by the ability to exist within complexity, where harshness and beauty are not opposites, but parts of the same continuous reality.